Colossians chapter 3, and we have finished up through verse 15 last time, which means we should be on verse 16. And I'm going to defer 16 and 17 until next week because I want to make sure that we have enough time to discuss 18 and 19 and maybe even 20 and 21. These passages are thought by some to be controversial. In my opinion, the controversy is not around understanding what they say. The controversy appears to be around how to apply them in daily life. So I'm also going totally contrary to my nature and using this PowerPoint thing, which, as some of you all know, gives me a fever and the chills. But anyway, I'm doing that for tonight only because what I want to do is emphasize what the scriptures have to say. And I figured it'd be harder for you all to organize it if we just read the verses and then went on to the next one, then the next one. But if you see how they cluster, I think it's a pretty powerful message. So that's what we're going to do. And so what I've done is on the PowerPoints, I have clustered verses according to topic to help us organize how they are. Okay, that's very interesting that you look at verses 18 and 19, and Paul gives those one sentence. And they're very important topics. Now, if they're so important, why does Paul only give the Colossians one sentence? Well, I'll give you my best guess as to why he does that. Look over in chapter 4, verse 16, and he says, and when this letter is read among you, the letter that we're reading right now to the Colossians, when this letter is read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans. And you, for your part, read my letter that is coming from Laodicea. So, obviously, he wrote a letter to the church in Laodicea, but we don't have a copy of it, so we don't know what it said. But we also know that he wrote a letter to the church at Ephesus, which was not that far from Colossae. And so there is circumstantial evidence that suggests that the letter that was delivered to Colossae was also delivered to Ephesus, and probably the same courier, who could have been Tychicus, was delivered to Philemon, because they're all in the same part of the area. In fact, there's substantial evidence that suggests that Philemon lived in Colossae. Okay, so since that's the case, let's consider these two verses, first of all, for what they are, and then let's look at what the Colossians would have had to look at, and they'd say, hey, didn't he write a letter to the Ephesians? Well, let's go see what he said to them. And what that does is elaborates on what he says here. So, first of all, verse 18, wives, be subject to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. So, the word that causes problems sometimes is the word be subject to, and I looked up that word, and I tell you, you all who are here all the time know I don't speak Greek, but I got a Greek dictionary, and it tells me right. Wives, be subject to your own husbands comes from a Greek word that's spelled Hupotasso. Yes, it's up there. How about that? I'd call it hupotasso. I don't know what that means, if I'm even saying it right. But that's what it means. And then it says, as is fitting in the Lord. So this Greek word, which we will look at in a few minutes from now, means to subject yourselves to, which means that the wife has an obligation to do something on her own. It says, you subject yourselves to, which means the wife is making an effort to fulfill this command. And then it also says, as is fitting in the Lord. Now, what that tells us is that there is a proper way for a wife to subject herself to her husband. As is fitting in the Lord, that's the way a Christian is supposed to do it, however that is. So how is that? One wonders. Well, that's where Ephesians chapter 5 comes in handy. And you look at chapter 5, and we're going to look at some verses in there, but we're going to look at them one at a time. Ephesians chapter 5 is where Paul explains that what he's doing is talking about the marriage relationship as a relationship that's similar to the relationship between Christ and the church. So look at Ephesians 5:32. This mystery is great, but I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. So this whole thing about Ephesians 5 is his way of explaining to them the relationship between Christ and the church, and he uses the marriage relationship as a way to illustrate that. So I put up there, wives, be subject to your husbands, and there's the hupotasso thing up there. And as is fitting, is explained in Ephesians 5:22 through 23, and let's read those two verses. Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. So that's the way he explains the relationship down through this. And it's interesting to me that Paul removes all doubt down there in verse 32 when he says, lest you don't get the point, here's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Christ and the church, and I've used the marriage relationship to explain that. Okay, so it says the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church, Ephesians 5:23, we just read that. And then it says wives are to subject themselves to their husbands as the church is subject to Christ. Ephesians 5:24 says, but as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. Well, just think about how is the church subject to Christ? Well, that's quite a relationship there. Who is the one with the authoritative responsibility there? Well, it's obviously Christ. Now let's go to 19 in chapter 3. Husbands. Husbands, love your wives, and do not be embittered against them. And I got to admit, I've studied this passage many times, and I came up with my own idea of what it means to be embittered. So I was kind of in the ballpark, but I don't think I was really right about that. I looked up the Greek word for that. Oh, let's see. Wait a minute, I got a thing here. Let's see if it works. No. What did I do now? Turn it off? Which button do you press to make it go forward?
You're there.
I'm there? I know, but I got there accidentally. I'd like to do it on purpose next time.
Push it again and see what happens. Normally, if it works, you're going to push that button.
I did that when nothing happened. I love technology. My horse and buggy's parked right outside. Okay, now let's look about the husbands. Colossians 3:19 says, husbands, love your wives. Do not be embittered against them. All right, I looked that up. And you can look on the overhead there. Yeah. Husbands are to love their wives, and that, there's two words that you hear about in sermons all the time for love, phileo, brotherly type love, friendly, and then you hear agape, which is to have someone's best interest at heart. That's the deeper kind of love, where you're doing things that you really hope are in the best interest of somebody else. That's the kind of love that a husband is to have for his wife. And then it says, do not be embittered against them. All right, here's what this embittered stuff means. It comes from the word, how do you say that? Pikrino or something like that. And look at what it means. Cutting, sharp, biting, stinging. According to Vine. Now, what married couple does not understand what that really means? What married couple perhaps has not experienced that? Think about words. Cutting, sharp, biting, stinging, bitter. Husbands are not supposed to use those kind of words. The opposite of bitter, according to Vine's Greek dictionary, is mild. So we got bitter versus mild. And Simpson, in all of his wisdom, wrote, under no circumstances is a husband to be bitter toward his wife. And the command to avoid bitterness avoids scriptural protection to to the wife. Okay, and I came up with my own examples of what that is, and I don't know that I really had to come up with them because you all might know them from listening to others or from experience yourself. What is example of bitter words, abusive words, insulting words, disrespectful words, belittling words, making fun of type words, and unfair criticism words? Now, what is our tendency to do as humans when we're angry? We issue bitter words toward the object of our anger. And what he's saying is, don't do that. Well, this passage is not easy. Because in anger, you're not always thinking, I need to not be bitter. But we need to try. Okay, well, I'm going to press the magic button here. And nothing happened. So I'll press it again. And nothing happens. So now I'll press the blank button, which turns it off. And then I turn it on, and still nothing happens. Look at there. Okay, we're going to consider this subjection business, but let's look at the husbands first. If a wife is to be in subjection to her husband, what does she have a right to expect from this guy? And the scriptures tell us what she has a right to expect. You can go to these scriptures if you want to, but I've quoted them pretty much verbatim. Colossians chapter 3:19, we've just said, husbands, love your wives in a way with their best interest at heart, agape, and do not be embittered against them with that kind of speech. Now we've gone back to...
I think you're having technical difficulties. Let's figure it out. You messed up, Bobby.
Slide 16, I think, is the one we want. There we go. Isn't that nice? All that happened, I didn't even touch a button. Okay, now let's go to Ephesians 5:23. Some of these passages we'll read multiple times because Ephesians 5 is full of this kind of instruction. Ephesians 5:23 says, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. Well, we know what it means to have Christ as the head of the church. It means we follow his instruction. Well, it says the husband is the head of the wife in the same way. So the husband has a responsibility to be the head of that family. Okay, Ephesians 5:25. Husbands, love your wives. Just as, how much should I love my wife? Just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. Well, that's a whole lot of love. That's a lot. How much am I supposed to love her? Well, as much as Christ loved the church. And what did he do? He went to the cross. That's a lot of love. Ephesians 5, verses 28 and 29. So husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. Now, what man is there, especially one that stops every now and then in front of a mirror to check to see if his hair is okay? What man is there who doesn't love his own body? Might be some of us that love it too much because we're always checking. But husbands are to love their own wives as their own bodies, and he who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church. Nourishes and cherishes. Now, I tend to think that the word nourish there, it might include actual supplying food, but I think it's more like spiritual nourishment, where he is making sure that the wife has access to the spiritual food that she needs. Okay? Then we go to 1 Peter 3:7. Familiar passage. 1 Peter 3:7 says, you husbands, likewise, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with a weaker vessel, since she is a woman. I like that. That explains a whole lot. Live with her in an understanding way, as with a weaker vessel, since she's a woman. Husbands are supposed to notice that. And there's a difference between men and women. As if you didn't know. And grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Is there anything hanging on how well husbands treat their wives? Yes. The last part of this verse is sobering. So that your prayers may not be hindered. And how do we view her spiritually? As a second-class citizen? No. It says the wife is a fellow heir of the grace of life. In God's eyes, her soul is just as valuable as the husband's. So, interesting. Well, the weaker vessel, we're to live with her in an understanding way. Husbands, have you ever come home and gone into the bedroom and your wife is lying in the bed and she's crying? And you say, "What's wrong?" And she says, "I don't know." Somebody identifies with that. Okay, and then you say, "Is it something I said?" No. Is it something I did? No. Well, is there anything I can do to help you? No. Well, what's wrong? I don't know. Well, what would you like me to do? And the husband, who is thinking very logically, there's got to be a reason for this, but she can't tell him what it is. And he says, "What can I do to help?" And she says, "Hold me." The understanding husband will hold her, not understanding why he doesn't understand. But he's living with her in an understanding way. And I can tell from some of your reactions that that has taken place in some marriages. And then maybe an hour later, the husband's back outside watching the ball game, and the wife comes out of the bedroom, and she's happy, and it's as if nothing happened. And he says, as almost every husband in the world has said, "I don't understand." But he lived with her in an understanding way because he gave her what she needed. Well, there are some verbs that we saw. I underlined them as we went through those verses. But let me just tell you what the verbs are. Love as your own body. Do not be embittered. Act as the head. Nourish. Cherish. Live in an understanding way. Grant her honor. Treat her as a spiritual fellow heir, your spiritual equal. So there is no way in here that a husband has any scriptural authority to abuse his wife, mistreat his wife, insult his wife, or badmouth her in front of other people. It's just not supposed to happen. The wife is not a spiritual second-class citizen. When they got married, the Bible said they became one. There's that. Okay, now that's the kind of husband that the Christian is supposed to be, and that's the kind of husband that the wife has a right to expect. So let's look at what the wife's obligation is. This hupotasso stuff. When we go back to what we had where wives being subject to husbands, came from that word hupotasso, and here we go again. Nothing happens. Still nothing happens. There we go. Hupotasso. So what I did was I went through and found several verses that contained this word, which is the identical word of what a wife is supposed to do toward her husband. And I'm just going to read these. I'm not going to go through the verses. You can check them, but they're pretty much verbatim. Titus 2:9 says, urge bondslaves, that's slaves, to be subject to their own masters in everything, to be well-pleasing and not argumentative. To what degree is a slave subject to his master? Pretty much. 1 Peter 2:18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. 1 Peter 2, 13 and 14. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to king as one in authority or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers. To what degree is the Christian to submit to the government? Well, we know with the exception of Acts 5:29, which says we ought to obey God rather than men, that means we follow the laws. Titus 3:1, remind them to be subject to rulers, to authorities, to be obedient, and to be ready for every good work. And there's that word again, hupatao. Remind them to be subject to rulers and to authorities. Okay. We hit some more buttons. See what happens. That's not right. That's right. Okay. Hebrews 13:17. People usually apply this to Christians in a church and elders. It says, obey your leaders and submit to them. The literal translation from Barry's translation in the Greek English is, obey your leaders and be submissive. James 4:7. Submit therefore to God. The literal translation, subject yourselves to God. Well, what does that mean we do with God? We follow his lead. Ephesians 5:24, as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. And there's that word, as the church is subject to Christ. Well, we look at Christ as our leader. The literal translation from Barry is, they take the literal word for the translated church, ecclesia, and translate it as assembly. It's the same thing. As the assembly is subject to Christ, so also wives to their own husbands. So I'm getting the drift there. Now let me ask you some questions. I'm pressing buttons. Nothing's happening. There we go. I've got the verses up there that we just read. Question. Were bond slaves to be subject to their masters only if they agreed? Are Christians to submit to human institutions, kings or governors, the government, only if we agree? There's a lot of things I don't like, but the Bible says I need to submit to them. Are Christians to be subject to rulers and authorities only if we agree? Are Christians to submit to our leaders, elders in the congregation only if we agree? Is the church subject to Christ only if we agree with his word? And I think you're getting the drift here. These things are commands. They're not suggestions. Pressing some more buttons. Coming up empty. There we go. So now let's take the verb, the words, the verses that have to do with what wives are supposed to do. Uses the exact same word we've just looked at. Colossians 3:18. Wives, be subject to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Literally. Wives, subject yourselves to your own husbands. Ephesians 5:22. Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. Literal translation. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands. Ephesians 5:24. As the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. Literal. As the assembly is subject to Christ, so also wives should be to their own husbands. Titus 2:4 and 5. Older women, and I left out some of the end part that doesn't have to do with this, but anyway, you can look that up if you like. Older women are told to encourage young women to be subject to their own husbands. 1 Peter 3:1. In the same way, you wives be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives. 1 Peter 3:5. For in this way, in former times, the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands. And my question that has to do with these verses is, are wives to be subject to their own husbands only if they agree with them? Well, I've sat in on some sessions where husbands and wives were having problems. And I remember one particular case where there was lots of problems. The wife was asked, will you agree to follow your husband's lead on matters that don't do with whether something is sinful or not? And her answer was, if I agree with it. Now, was that biblical subjection? And I'd say no. Now, Paul, I think, summarizes very well the obligation that all of us have, husbands and wives. In Ephesians chapter 5:33, he says this: let each individual among you, talking to men here, also love his own wife, even as himself. And let the wife see to it that she respect her husband. And my suggestion to people who aren't married, to all of you who are married, it's too late. You can't make another choice. You're stuck with that person. But to people who aren't married, a man, when he's dating a woman, should select a future wife whom he can love as he loves himself. What he also, if he's smart, will look out as, do they fight over every little thing while they're dating? Where they're going to eat? What movie they're going to see? This kind of stuff. Now, that's not to say that when they're dating, the guy's supposed to dominate everything that happens and announce where they're going to go, and she's like, oh, yes, sir. That's not it. But are there hints that perhaps the marriage is going to be the same way? The woman who's dating a guy, he might be good looking. He might be funny. But she ought to select a future husband whose decisions she can respect as the head of the family. Because 20 years later, when he gets that little gut that he didn't have when he was 20, he's not going to be as cute. But do you respect him? Okay, now, you say, wow, that's pretty hardcore. Well, it's also scriptural. Now, let me give you a hypothetical situation of how that might play out, because understanding this, to me, is not the difficulty. Applying it is the difficulty. How should it work? Let's take a situation where a husband and a wife, they love each other, and they're just the way they ought to be. He loves her like he loves himself. He honors her. He cherishes her. He nourishes her. He looks out for his best interest. He can't wait to make her happy. And she respects him like crazy. I'm so glad I married this guy. But now a situation has come up where it's not a matter of to sin or not to sin. It's a matter of, it might be something to do with parenting. Should we let the kids do this or not? It might be a matter of a financial decision. Should we sell this house and buy a bigger one? It might be, do you think we need to get a newer car? It's a situation where there is not an obvious right answer. There's not an obvious best answer. So the husband, I think if he is thinking about his wife and valuing her in an understanding way, will say to her, we got to make a decision. What are your thoughts on this? And she says, well, I think we ought to do option A, whatever that is. And he says, why do you think that? And she tells him, well, because this and this and this. And he says, I see. He says, well, let me tell you what I think. I think we ought to do option B. And she says, why do you think that? And he says, because this and this and this. Now keep in mind again, the answer, the best answer, the happy ending is not obvious. If it were, they wouldn't be having this discussion. But a decision has to be made. What are we going to do about the kids? What are we going to do about the house? What are we going to do about the car? And the husband says, after he has listened very carefully and sincerely to what she has to say, well, I don't agree with that. I think we ought to go ahead and do this one. But I thought they were a team. They are. But when the vote is 1-to-1, and they don't really vote, but she's expressing her opinion and he's expressing his opinion, somebody has to be the tiebreaker. And I think God has said the husband is the tiebreaker. All right, let's go on to sometime into the future. And what happens if the husband is right And the decision that he suggested works out just fine. What is the smart, wise, caring husband going to do? Is he going to go, ha, 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 see, I was right, dummy? That's bitter. No, he's not going to do that. What is she going to say? You were lucky. That's not respectful. Now let's take the worst case scenario. It turns out that the choice he made was wrong. It did not have a happy ending. What should he do? Well, first of all, men have a tendency to be stubborn and have a hard time admitting that they've ever been wrong. So what the husband really ought to do here is say, I was wrong. We should have done it your way. Is that easy for a man to do? Tell your wife that you were wrong? No, I got to tell you, that's not easy. If what he chose was wrong and they followed through with it and it blew up in their face, what should she do? Should she say, see, I told you you should have listened to me, dummy? Well, that's not respectful either. Now, there's nothing in the scriptures that say that when the husband makes a decision, he's infallibly correct all the time. Husbands sometimes make bad decisions, and they pay the price. And the wife might say, well, I tried to tell you. But he ought to go ahead and say, yeah, I should have listened to you. Next time, I will. Now, what comments does anybody have? And how far off base am I in accurately presenting what the scriptures say?
Well, we should all be glad Paul explained it the way he did in Ephesians 5, that this is compared to Christ and his church. You have a church that is always ready to submit to Christ, and you have Christ that is always ready to lead his church, his bride.
Not only to lead the church, but to love the church. What else?
The whole scheme of things, for everything you said, for the church, for our husbands and wives, it is the submission. We do what we are supposed to do. We do what the Bible says about everything in the church. It's not what we want, it's what Christ wants.
Yes. Okay, I got another question for you, but I want to give everybody else a chance to freelance if somebody's got something to say. Okay, now let me ask you this. What are the cultural influences that have impacted marriages that cause some people to really bristle at this scriptural teaching? What's going on in our culture that impairs that?
Feminism.
Feminism. You care to elaborate on that?
Well, what happened in the 60s, and it's just grown more every year.
Okay. She said feminism, and she speaks like a woman. Very tender. She talked about feminism. And I've thought about why is this an issue for Christians? And feminism is one of the things. And you hear a woman say, I'm never going to live under a man's thumb. Well, is that the kind of relationship that God described here, that Paul described, of a woman living under a man's thumb? That's not the way Christ felt about the church. That's not the way he says a husband feels about a wife. That's why I went ahead and did the husband stuff first. Because if this man is really living as a husband like a Christian ought to live, he doesn't want anybody under his thumb. He wants a partner. In the Old Testament, it said Adam needed a help suitable for him. Somebody who made him better, not somebody to be his servant, his slave. Well, something else. Does the term toxic masculinity mean anything to you? We've had a movement for the last 8 or 10 years in our culture that says males can be way too masculine. Toxic masculinity. So you talked about feminism, and I would say there has been a feminization of men also. Men are to be spineless and weak. Now, there's some other things that go on in our culture. The sexual revolution. Most of this stuff did have its beginning in the 60s. And that means it was my generation and your generation where all this stuff was. I was in college when this stuff all started. And the sexual revolution was part of the revolution where young people were becoming resistant to anything that reeked of authority. Rejecting authority. Now, another thing that didn't help any at all was when they created birth control pills. Because that meant there was no longer any reason for people not to have sexual relations. Because now you could do birth control pills and avoid the problem. Which makes you think, how stupid that we have all these abortions. That's selfish. There's a way to prevent that. People don't want to do it. Jimmy?
I was thinking, way back in Genesis, we read that God saw that it was not good for man to be alone. But he also, through the words we've looked at tonight, also saw that it was not good for us not to know what our roles were. And he's clearly defined them for us. And again, some people will look at that as a restrictive. You're putting me in this box, a box I don't want to be in. When ultimately, just as he saw it wasn't good for man to be alone, he saw that it was not good for us not to know what our roles are. And so if we will listen to him and we will follow the instructions, he designed us, he knows how we're wired, he's put us together,
Yeah.
then it will go well for us.
This relationship that Paul and Peter have described is a wonderful relationship. And there's no reason why the man and the woman shouldn't be very, very happy in that relationship. I've heard people say, you know what, marriage is a 50-50 proposition. You know what I'd say? That's not true. It's 100-100. As the husband, I've got to put forth my effort to be the kind of husband I need to be. But as the wife, she needs to put forth the kind of effort that the wife needs to be. And the verb there, this hupato, or whatever the thing is I said, hupatasso, that is to subject oneself, which means it is a purposeful cognitive effort to have this kind of relationship. It's not one where somebody is now somebody's slave and some poor old woman is under this cruel dictator's thumb. That's not what it is at all.
The other mistake we make is we make our behavior dependent on the behavior of the other person.
There's that.
You're not going to live up to your piece of it, well, I'm not going to live up to my piece of it. We think that's
Well, there's one more huge thing that gets in the way of happy marriages. And as both parties can be a victim of this, and the villain of it, selfishness. I want it, and I want it my way. Well, I hope as you listen to this, and go back and realize all we did was read verses. And I threw in a nickel's worth of commentary. But I think the commentary was based on the verses. Thank you all for your attention.